First of all, thank you everyone for coming this morning, and thanks for Marxism for inviting me back again. A couple of weeks ago when I was first asked to do this meeting, the answer really seemed to be yes. I was going to stand up and go yes, and then sit down again, and that was the end of that. Because at the time, it looked like either Iran had planted limpet mines on oil tankers or the US Black Ops had fired missiles at them, and it looked like at the time, even though no one was quite sure what was taking place, it looked like there was some kind of drive towards war in which the US will find any kind of excuse, in this case an attack supposedly by Iran on the tankers, to begin a war. And we were really beginning to think that there was this massive drive to war. It was there was going to be some kind of huge attack on Iran. And then last week, Iran went and shot down a $150 million US drone, which is the equivalent of walking into the bar in the East End, finding the biggest bloke and then punching him straight in the face. If you want to start a fight, shoot down an American plane. And what happened subsequently really kind of began to throw all this into doubt, because here was a reason for war. The Iranians had actually attacked an American drone, and they said they did it. Yes, we did it. We just blew up, one of your most sophisticated pieces of equipment. ComEd, let's have this fight. At which point you had the most extraordinary statement come out of the White House, which was Trump was very worried about killing 110 Iranians if he was to launch an attack. So obviously, killing tens of thousands in Iraq didn't count, and so on. So you begin to see, actually, that it's not quite so clear what this drive for war is. Is there a drive for war, and what kind of machinations are taking place inside of the U.S. Administration? And it's when you read, I read quite a lot of the Arab press, and some of the really, some excellent journalists and so on, who consider Trump to be completely erratic, who considers him to be illogical, who consider that the cabal around Trump seems to be completely off the leash, and that he's making sudden and wild decisions, such as deciding suddenly to pull out troops from Syria, which runs against everything. We have to keep troops in Syria because of ISIS and so on. That he's pushing ahead with negotiations with the Taliban inside of Afghanistan and so on. That seems to completely undermine everything the US has done over the past 20, 18 years. And so you get the sense in which there is this kind of idea that what Trump is very irrational, very illogical, bad table manners, not very pleasant man who doesn't seem to know what he's doing. I'm going to actually argue this is not actually the case, that what Trump represents is both continuity of US policy in the Middle East, but also a reflection of the way in which things have changed dramatically since the invasion of Iraq, actually going back 4 decades. I think we have to start by saying that the drive to war is not really rooted in kind of illogical decisions of an administration. The drive to war is rooted in the way in which capitalism works, the way in which capitalism develops into imperialism, the way in which there is a link between capital accumulation, making profits, industry, and so on, and the military and states that house these various capitals, and that it's structurally part of the very system. War, imperialism, is structurally part of the very system. It's and the context, I guess, in which the chaos that the US finds itself in the Middle East is a reflection of the shifts and changes that have taken place over the last 4 decades. And I think it's quite important that we put this into perspective. I grew up in Kuwait and then in Beirut, and I come from a Lebanese family, and the joke was always about the Saudis. We always made jokes about the Saudis. These were quite ignorant desert people, unlike us on the coast, who are very sophisticated and so on. And all the kind of jokes that I used to hear my uncles and my dad for example, say about the Saudis, they didn't understand they had to refill the car with petrol, for example, so they'd buy with oil dollars these expensive cars, drive them, they'd run out of petrol, stupid Saudis, etc., they simply think it's broken, go buy a new car, everyone laughs, and so on. And then when you talk about the beginning of oil production in Saudi Arabia, that the Americans offered the Saudi king in the 1932 $30,000 in gold for the right of the US to exploit all oil out of Saudi Arabia, and actually where Saudi Arabia is today, which is Saudi Aramco, was one of the biggest companies in the world. The Saudi wealth fund we're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars. It's absolutely huge. That the relative rise, not only of Saudi Arabia in terms of its wealth, in terms of its industry, and in terms of the way it's come out of what we would call a sort of era of ignorance to actually being quite sophisticated and so on, has begun to really change. And also the way in which other nations inside of the Middle East, Turkey, Iran, we could talk about the Khaliji groups, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and so on, how these have now become quite important centers of capital accumulation that isn't simply about handing stuff over to big imperialism. There is a very important relationship between oil dollars, the way in which oil dollars move through Western banks and so on. This is still a very intricate relationship that's not quite the same as the way in which oil exploitation started in the Middle East 50 or 60 years ago. And we could talk about the oil shocks of the 1970s when oil prices went up massively, and so on, as the beginning of that process in which we can talk about the development of a series of what we kind of call, a little bit crudely, but we'll call it kind of rise of sub-imperialism inside the Middle East. And it's also really important to put that in the context of which we don't use the word imperialism as an insult. I mean, we do use it, obviously, as an insult. But it isn't simply there is one imperial power. It's like, Darth Vader, there's one imperial power and everyone else is kind of, subjugated to it. Imperialism itself is a global system in which the US, at the moment, in this particular point in history, is the most dominant. But, go back 50, 60, 70, 80 years, and we're talking about France and Britain. 10, 15 years. In the future, we might be talking about a dominant China. Actually, it's continually changing and continually unstable. We can talk about the way in which Soviet imperialism, or the imperialism of the Soviet Union, collapsed and then re-emerged under the Putin regime. And we have to understand that this imperialism is in a constant struggle and a constant competition with each other, in which you can't simply reduce it either to military or to economic. It's a combination of these things. So, for example, Russia has massive military power, especially in Syria and in the Middle East, but actually marginal economic interest. Russia itself is a huge oil producer. It's not really that interested in grabbing more oil production. China, on the other hand, probably controls most of the oil coming out of Iraq, but has no military presence whatsoever inside of the Middle East. So you can have this combination of imperialism, in which some are working for the group. So, China's interests inside of Iraq are covered a certain amount by the US, but also by Iran, and so on. So we can see that this interlocking, we can't simply reduce to one thing or another, but we have to look very much at how it works in particular places. But that, as a center of imperial conflict and competition, the Middle East has been very, very crucial for the last century. And so, when we now look at the Middle East, especially after the US's vainglorious defeat inside of Iraq, that we have to now begin to kind of reanalyze or rework the analysis for understanding the new dynamics in the Middle East. One of the dangers, obviously, when people call you an expert, one of the dangers is people kind of expect you to be able to explain every single move inside, let's say, Syria or inside of Lebanon or inside of Iraq. Actually, it's really, really difficult because it's so integrated and complex and chaotic. quite often things seem completely out of place and something out of the comic books. We had the situation recently where the CIA-backed section of the Syrian rebels were fighting the State Department backed rebels. And so you can see this as just being a kind of joke, in a sense, or complete, but it's really useful actually to think of it as being a completely illogical and chaotic system, which actually makes it really, which makes it really dangerous. So when we talk about Iran and we talk about the kind of new competition that's taking place in the, I think it's important that we also understand the way in which the US was defeated inside of Iraq. So in 2003, the George W. Bush's administration, along with Tony Blair and a few others, were attempting to project US power for what they kind of described as kind of a project for the new American century. How is a weakening US imperialism going to be able to project its power in the future? And Iraq seemed like low-hanging fruit. It was a very unpopular regime. It had been under sanctions for years and years and years. There had already been a war in 1991 in which a large section of the Iraqi army had been decimated. And so it seemed actually quite an easy thing to do. So the invasion itself of Iraq, instead of strengthening US power, they destroyed the Ba'athist regime, they demolished the Iraqi military, and then suddenly find themselves facing insurgency in which Iran was to emerge as a key player, mainly through backing Shia militias and so on, and taking advantage of the sectarian system that the West then imposed inside of Iraq. So for Iran, the US invasion of Iraq was a blessing. It was a massive opportunity. It was a regional shock in which the Iranians became the most important players, not the only players, but the most important players inside of Iraq. So it makes what happens in Iraq and the continuing instability in Iraq a massive headache for the US and for the West, in which they need Iran to help keep it stabilized. When I was sort of doing quite deep, and when I was following quite deeply the civil war, development of civil war inside of Syria, but also the emergence of ISIS in eastern Syria and Iraq. The most amazing video of a laughing Shia military commander ordering a US airstrike through a Kurdish intermediary on Sunni militias. And he was laughing, he was going, look at me, I'm about to call a US airstrike, me a Shia, Islamist, on a Sunni position. And you begin to see actually how chaotic and complex it is. So for Iraq to be any kind of stability, to form any kind of a basis for any kind of future stable regime, the West needs Iran. This is really, really crucial. Without Iran, really the whole country will fall apart and become fall apart even further and become even more dangerous. And then when we look also at some of the other forces beginning to appear, so we have a relative decline of US power. We then begin to see these rising economic powers beginning to take on riskier and riskier enterprises. Of course, the most important one outside of Iran and the Gulf is Turkey. And you see the way in which Turkey, for example, has pretty much acquired most of northern Iraq. All the new construction is taking place is Turkish construction. Most of the oil going from the Kurdish regions in Iraq are now going to Turkey. And actually now quite a lot of Iranian oil is also going to Turkey. Iranian oil is also important to China. So you begin to see in which the kind of games which is being played by the US and so on is very, very dangerous in terms of kind of the whole stability for the region and the way in which they kind of hope something will begin to emerge. I want to talk a little bit more about Saudi Arabia because it's important that we understand also the kind of limits of what's going on. So you have Saudi regime. It begins to become wealthier and wealthier. It begins to become quite a major player in the world capitalist system. This is no longer simply, some ignorant sheikhs in a tent in the desert, but actually quite important global capitalist players. now the Saudi regime under Mohammed bin Salman, people know him by his street tag of MBS, has been this kind of new force inside of Saudi Arabia that is going to project Saudi military might, that's going to project Saudi military influence, both soft and hard. And there are various problems with that. The first one being that they launched a war in Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the Middle East, one of the countries least able to defend itself, in which it should have been a very short war, with the troops from the United Arab Emirates, with a vast arsenal which is available to the Gulf states that they've been buying off the West for the last 40 years. Really, Yemen should have fallen in 2 or 3 weeks, maybe 6 months. But we're now like 5, 6, 7 years into this war, and there's really no sign of Yemen falling to Saudi Arabia. Why is this important? Because for a lot of Americans, when they talked about, for example, the Saudi Air Force, they always talked about it as being a very sophisticated gentleman's flying club. They would buy these very sophisticated US military planes, British aircraft and so on, but they never actually used them. Saudi power was always about money. It was always about militias. It was always about where they threw their influence through cash. Now that they were gone onto the hard base of kind of direct military intervention, suddenly they find themselves very, very limited. And the questions then start to arise. If we can't subjugate Yemen, poor as it is, then what chance do we have in a war against Iran? So you begin to see in which the limits of Saudi power are also important. So the Saudi Arabia itself is attempting to adapt. They're going through some kind of neoliberal restructuring. I read recently, much to my surprise, that the Saudis have divested their $3 trillion oil fund from the oil industry. And I was like, oh, in the age of global warming, this is quite a good move, really. So they're throwing, they're dumping, obviously there's huge amounts of oil infrastructure. They're dumping it all. This is quite an extraordinary move, until you realize actually what they've done is that they've dumped all the oil infrastructure, which is going to be useless in a few years' time, on the Saudi people. They've basically cashed in all the oil profits, disconnected it from Saudi Arabia, dumped all the stranded assets of the oil industry onto the Saudi people, and now simply going to take these trillions of dollars of oil wealth away from Saudi Arabia and invest it in renewables or whatever else that they're actually going to invest it in. So the Saudi ruling class is attempting to make a whole series of changes, a whole series of pivots, pivots as well. So it actually means that now that when you talk about the Middle East, we don't simply talk about the competition between the US and the USSR. We now talk about the competition between Russia, between the US, between Turkey, between Iran, between Saudi Arabia, and of course, always there in the background is Israel and what the Israelis do, and so on. So this makes the whole area very, very unstable. Iran itself is also more complex than I think the Americans or anyone else give credit for. If you think about Saudi Arabia, we think about Kuwait, we think about the oil states, really the only thing they have is oil. I say, I grew up in Kuwait. There was sand and oil. Really, that's all there was. The people who lived in Iran had many more industries. There's a huge agricultural industry. There's huge cotton. There's huge amounts of oil as well. Don't get me wrong. But there's also a much wider spread of industry than there is in the rest of the Arab world. And it is in 1908, with the first discovery of oil, which was in Iran, that triggers the great imperial rush to grab hold of this oil. So Iran, in history, becomes really a massive battlefield for influence, beginning with the British, the Russians, and then when the British and the Russians disappear, the Americans kind of step in. There was attempts in the 1950s, a mass movement to nationalize the oil, to try and bring, to get rid of imperialism really out of the country. It was a nationalist movement, it was secular, and so on. There are limits to it, and so on. And the US and Britain organized a coup, destroyed that movement, and put in the Shah, whose only claim to the right to be a Shah was that his grandfather was a sergeant in the British Army. He wasn't British, he was Iranian, he was a sergeant in the British Army, and they decided this guy will make a nice Shah, and this is the beginning of it. So they then lay the basis for the revolution in 1979. It's a popular revolution, it's a massive revolution. I remember at the time just being kind of, absolutely swept away by its sheer power and size and possibility. The internal dynamic of this revolution means the left lose. The rise of a new kind of Islamist regime begins. It then becomes the biggest danger to imperialism in the Middle East, whether you agree with what happened in Iran or not. As far as imperialism was concerned, this was like a massive danger. They backed Iraq under a man called Saddam Hussein to wage a war in the 1980s to try and destroy the Iranian Revolution. It is a disastrous war for both countries, but it's an absolutely catastrophic war for Iran. Iran then spends the rest of the 80s into the early 1990s trying to restructure and rebuild its economy. It's a mixture of state capitalism and private, private capital and so on, in which a new layer then begins to emerge, quite closely tied with the clerical, the clerical hierarchy, in which a new layer of quite wealthy Iranians then begin to form a new ruling class. And the process of revolution itself then begins to develop inside of Iran. In 2009, there was very close to a mass uprising. What they call then the Green Revolution. That showed actually the dynamic inside of Iran as well, as reflected the dynamic of the rest of the Middle East. For me, the 2009 revolution was simply the precursor to what was going to happen a few years later in the rest of the Arab world, the Egyptian Revolution, Tunisia, and so on, and the process that is still continuing. And so for Iranian capital, for them to survive, they require to export. They have to export, and so to be put under sanctions meant it began to cripple the economy. There were a few rays of light, if you like. The loss of Iraq meant that suddenly Iraq became flooded with Iranian goods, and so on. So Iran's influence, both as capital and as military, begins to spread. In sort of around the time, during the Obama administration, there is a bit of a shift that takes place. There is something called the G5+1, which was the Security Council plus Germany, negotiate a deal with Iran in which to, remove many of the sanctions, bring Iran back into the fold on the basis that Iran then kind of begins to put a limit to its nuclear ambitions. And it looked like we had a period in which there was going to be some kind of stability in terms of they knew basically everyone was going to be tied into a system. Then along comes Trump, simply tears all this up, decides once again that that there's much more to be made, much better chance really to impose US hegemony by allying itself more directly militarily with Saudi Arabia and trying to once again sort of ratchet up the war, ratchet up a threat of war, I should say. And so we have the situation that we're in now, where the US is attempting to do several things. The first thing, of course, is the continuing pivot to the east. China is much more important than Iran. The String of Pearls development, the new Silk Road, the rise of China economically means that actually that's much more a focus of US policy than the old industries of oil. I'm glad we can begin to call it the old industries of oil. And that the attempt by kind of more sensible elements of kind of global powers, the European Union, United Nations, to kind of stabilize the area has once again gone backwards. Thank you. So I guess what we're saying is this: if you follow any kind of logic in which most of us conduct our daily lives, this is bad for you, don't do it, being kind of one of them. The other one is don't pick a fight with someone who's going to beat you up. That's another really good one. But then what we do then is not use that logic when we talk about imperialism. When we talk about imperialism, we talk about capitalism, we have to use the logic of capital. That is, the way in which capitalism constantly forces expansion, constantly forces looking for new markets, constantly forces looking for new sources of raw materials, and this is the main driver. So we say, okay, what does that mean to a region in which oil is becoming, it's still important, don't get me wrong, but it's becoming less and less important, in which it's becoming more and more unstable. And actually, as the Americans found out, destroying Iraq and taking Iraq had no advantage to them whatsoever. All it did was show them up to be weak. Why would you then go and then make threats against war against Iran, which has a much more sophisticated military, much bigger military than the US, and it has a really nice long coastline made of mountains, where all oil traveling through most of the oil traveling through the Middle East passes through a choke point, the Gulf, in the Iranian Gulf, where it's really 38 miles between one coast and the other. One coast is a massive Iranian military in which they spent, 40 years sticking it under mountains and so on, which is really quite hard. And the Americans can demolish stuff, don't get me wrong. But the risk of then igniting a war in which really all you need is a rocket-propelled grenade to take out an oil tanker suddenly becomes a point of extreme instability. So why then would Trump start beating the drum of war, seem to put forward a casus belli, a reason for war, which was the limpet mines or rockets or whatever it was on the oil tankers, and then completely and utterly pull back at the last minute when a reason for war itself did present itself? I think it's precisely that instability inside of the US administration, how you deal with a region in which there's now many more powers, how you deal with a region in which it's no longer predictable what you're going to do. And to be honest with you, I think Trump was puffing up the stuff of war because there's an election coming up. I think he wanted to kind of do this diversion. I think the Iranians called this bluff, blew up an important piece of military equipment, which was an utter humiliation for the US. I mean, I don't know if people see, they were treating the downing of the, there was some jokes going around, treating the downing of the drone as a kind of, what about the drone's children and its family, how's it going to deal with it, and all that kind of stuff. That the drone itself has much more, humanity in it than tens of thousands of Latinos in Mexico and so on. So you begin to see in which the kind of instability that imperialism brought to the Middle East, the rise of the new powers, and the way in which they're competing with each other, actually makes the whole region a tinderbox. I would like to end with this, because I'd like to end on a positive note, but I'm going to temper it with a completely negative note. The positive note for me is when the head of OPEC, I think it was yesterday or the day before, blamed Greta Thunberg and the climate movement for destroying the future of oil. And I'm like, I would like to thank them personally, because if we destroy the future of oil, then you destroy the future of wars inside the Middle East. Oil, for people of the Middle East, has been an absolute curse. And any money, and any thought that we would get any of that money back at any kind of point seems really isn't going to happen. But what I would like to see, more than anything else, is the mass climate strike movement that will destroy the future of oil, alongside a mass workers' revolution inside of the Middle East, like we're seeing in Sudan and Algeria, and we saw in Egypt and so on. You begin to see that. There is a kind of final thing, which is, unfortunately, because of the logic of capitalism, because of the way in which such huge amounts of money and investment have gone into a future, development of oil production, that actually they're not going to abandon oil. They're going to fight really hard to keep it, even though we know it's killing the planet. It's killing the planet in the way it's killed the Middle East, and so on. So is there a future for oil? I don't think there's a future for oil. But is there going to be a fight over the struggle for oil? Absolutely. And there's so much invested in this that I think it's going to be quite a huge fight. But I just want to end. But let's not fall into this trap of simply thinking Trump is some kind of idiot. Okay, he is kind of idiotic, but there is a continuity to what he does. There is belief that he represents a strategy inside of the US. It's not simply a fool running around not knowing what he's doing, although it really feels that way, and that there was a more sensible policy under a man called Obama beforehand, and there'll be a more sensible policy in the future under Biden or whoever takes over. We have to really, really understand that there's been very little shift between Democrat and Republican over the last years. Trump gave the green light to the shifting the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He gave the green light for the annexation of the Golan Heights. He gave the green light for a massive acceleration of the expulsion of Palestinian people from eastern Jerusalem. But actually, all he's done is be a bit more cruder than what was happening before. The U.S. embassy has been on the state has been the law in the U.S. since 1995. Subsequent, more progressive U.S. regimes never dumped it. It was actually simply a cruder version of what they were already doing. And so we have to be really careful in simply saying, this guy's a madman, he's crazy, he's illogical. Actually, all he's reflecting is the chaos that is taking place inside of imperialism. And he's not very sophisticated about it, but that it is US policy and it is just a different version of US strategy. Will there be, I'm going to put myself on the line now, does Trump want war with Iran? I think he does not want war with Iran, but war itself can follow a logic on its own. And I think if there was to be a war with Iran, it would have taken place already. It would have taken place sometime last week. But I do believe that the continual imperial machinations inside of the Middle East makes it extraordinarily dangerous. And really, I would like to look forward to a future without oil, not simply for the planet, but actually for our people. But we know that this is going to be a tremendously difficult and long fight.
Very interesting talk, thank you. There's a few issues that I want to take up. I have an issue with Russia and China being described as imperialist. I think that fits that. Certainly capitalist. Certainly capital trying to expand, I accept that. Imperialist? No, I don't think so. There was very little mention of Israel in terms of pushing for the Americans and also the nuclear issue. That wasn't touched upon at all. Netanyahu actually went into the Senate, wasn't invited by a sitting American president, putting his hands on the table and pushing. I think Israel is the sort of wild card in all this. I think Trump is a maverick. I think it's the people around him that sort of try to push him and say, you can't do this. I mean, a classic example is the British having the airports. I think he's an idiot. The importance of Turkey and Iran in the Middle East, they've got good relations, a very strong working class base. I think they're important in that respect. And there is an alignment, certainly, with Saudi and the Gulf states and the Sunni Shia sort of issue that they're trying to exploit. So my take on it is it's Israel pushing the Americans and the nuclear. I think war is probably likely. That's my opinion.
Thank you.
Really great, Simon. I was born in Baghdad, so I completely get the whole Middle Eastern sort of stereotypes that can happen in families. 100%. Sort of two questions. The first one is, do you think, in terms of parallel to the Iraq War, there's a difference in how this is sort of being built up? I mean, there was a Gallup poll done in 2014, and it asked, who do you think is the biggest world threat? And it asked every nation, well, most nations, not every nation, but yeah. And it was, US came on top by a huge amount. Iran was very small. And I think if you did that with Iraq, it would be a bit different. The second, yes, and also obviously in terms of the nuclear part, you've got people like Merkel saying good things about Iran. So I just wondering your opinions of the differences in sort of the approach and what's happening around the world about that. The second part is, I think you're completely right with the geography of Iran. It's essentially uninvadable when it comes to these Argos Mountains, and then you've got the sea. And I think Mattis has even said that the only way they could invade is by airstrikes, essentially. I was just wondering your opinion on, Jeremy Scahill from The Intercept wrote a few months ago that the Iraqi government have actually apparently let the US put special forces on the border with Iran. And I was just wondering obviously being half Iraqi, I was just wondering what's your take on what role would Iraq play in that, what sort of potential could they have, and just how they interlink essentially.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks. Just in terms of the first point that was made from the floor, I mean, the idea that China and Russia are expansive capitalist powers but not imperialist, from my understanding of imperialism, doesn't make any sense. The whole point about imperialism is it's about a struggle of capitalist powers to as they develop that evenly, to redistribute power in the world through military and economic means. And it seems to me that's precisely what China and Russia are doing. They sense that there's this long-term relative decline of US power, although America is still the most powerful capitalist state, and they're trying to push back on a regional and sometimes on a slightly more ambitious scale. And this is leading to all kinds of instability and conflicts within the system. So when we talk about imperialism, we're not talking about one state dominating all the rest of the states, we're talking about a system of inter-imperialist rivalry based on this uneven development of capitalism. The second thing I want to say is that we should be, Simon is right, we shouldn't underestimate Trump. Trump has a very considered and calculated worldview, and it involves breaking down the succession of global trade deals and partnerships that the US has entered into, and reconfiguring these for a series of unilateral deals with states, often brought about for a combination of bullying and negotiation. It's the only way you can really explain what Trump is doing in North Korea, in Iran, and elsewhere. And it's not true that Trump is just driven by the people around him. If you look at both North Korea and Iran, it involves slapping down people like Bolton, who are the most vociferous about going to war. It's not true that Trump is simply a slave to the people around him inside the White House. And we have to take him very seriously. Those people on the left who think Trump is an aberration, and he's going to lose an election and be a one-term president, don't count on it. Don't count on it. We have to take him seriously, even as we oppose him and fight him. The third and final point I want to make is about the dangers of war. Because even if neither side wants war, the dangers are real, because the system of an inter-imperialist conflict can lead to conflict emerging, even when neither parties go into those debates wanting conflict. And this is exacerbated by the process of the formation of these regional sub-imperialisms. Because as America has tried to pivot to China and withdrawn in relative terms from the region, a whole series of rival powers have emerged. Saudi Arabia, UAE, United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Israel is another one of them, seeking to reconfigure the region in their own interests. And it gives an additional level of instability and conflict in the region. And this is another factor which creates a possibility of war being triggered despite the intentions of Bush and despite the intentions of the key figures in the Iranian regime. So let's not underestimate the dangers of war, but let's also not underestimate what Trump is doing and what he stands for.
Cool. You at the back of the hat?
Oh yeah, just just two things really, Simon. One is I'd like to just expand on the relationship between Iran and China, because clearly some of the oil from Iran is going through China. And I wonder to what extent Iran is viewed in America as, if like, a proxy for China, and to what extent, therefore, military conflict with Iran could potentially be, if you like, a shot across the bows of China before there's any direct conflict there. So I'd just like to expand on that. That's something I'm not quite sure about. Second thing I wanted to say is I can remember 15 years ago, shortly after the end of the war, the hiatus in the war in Iraq, being on the streets campaigning against the war with Iran. I remember a lot of people saying the anti-war movement back over Iraq didn't stop the war with Iraq, and I always just thought but it stopped the war with Iran. actually the purpose was always about regime change in Iran. It was always about America regaining control of that key, was it three-legged stool, Israel, Egypt and Iran, I think was the analogy at the time. And that was always the real base of this. The defeat in Iraq has stopped that, but also the anti-war movement stopped it. It was the anti-war movement that made a continuation into a war with Iran impossible. And that's why an anti-war movement is so important. And actually having revolutionary socialists who can see that and can build that movement, as the SWP was absolutely central to the building of that movement at the time, is absolutely crucial. And if you're not a member of the SWP, and we'll be at the back of the room at the end, and feel free to join us to build that anti-war movement if it becomes necessary. Cheers.
I thought there was more space there.
One sort of statement and then a question. The statement is US oil production is actually higher than Saudi Arabia's now. That's because Trump and his cronies don't care about the public health consequences, about the environmental destruction. So in a way they're even less reliant on Middle East oil than was in the case in 2003. The question was, how far do you think the Iranian government are taking these steps of shooting down American drones out of a position of strength, that they think they can expand easily in the region? Or is that because they're desperately unpopular, they need to try and encourage the Iranian population that nationalism is the way forward, and not, in the middle of a big, deep recession, which is what they're going through at the time?
Thanks. The comment at the back of the earring. Can I just, say as well? I mean, if people just have like a really short question, that is absolutely fine. Be encouraged. But anyway,
I had a really short question.
Excellent.
Can you just say a bit about the left, or any existing left in Iran, and kind of what the current state of play is there?
That was very short. Anybody else? Yeah.
Thank you, Simon. I just wanted to ask, with the recent US ventures, what influence has Iran got to make now, in contrast to the influence made in Iraq after the war? So what new influence has Iran got to gain?
Yeah.
There's just been a reference to the anti-war movement here in this country, but there hasn't been any mention of the level of support there might be in America for war with Iran. I know the American public are flooded with anti-Iranian news media and so on, but I do wonder if that may be a factor in Trump's decision to pull back on his bellicose words and threatened actions, because during his election campaign he appeared to take a stand of kind of isolationist stand and pulling troops away from foreign wars and stuff like this. So I just wonder if that's something that ought to be addressed.
The comrade in the scarf.
Thank you. So I just wanted to address the notion about whether China's imperialist. I live in New Zealand, and it's really interesting to see, and quite scary in some ways as well, the role of Chinese imperialism in the Pacific. If you visit somewhere like Samoa, then you'll see the new police station. It's been built by money from China. Places like Vanuatu, deep water port, built by money from China. Tonga, the recent election, Tonga, massive influence by China, and battles going on within those countries about the reliance on Chinese money going in. And they're not just being kind to Pacific Islands, right? This is a very strategic military area that China and the US have battled over for a long time, and so that's been built up. There's been countries that have been looking to replace their telecom systems. This is all very familiar, isn't it? Huawei bidding for it, and actually the Aussie government stepping in, going, "That's all right, we'll build that for you. Don't you worry, we'll pay for it." In order, backed by the US, in order to prevent that expansion by China. So that's going to be a massive area to keep an eye on. And so the idea that it's not just about capitalist expansion and not imperialist, because there's no money in the islands. Nobody's going to make money just by building a police station there. This is about a serious move by China, and it's quite interesting. And it's maybe not a question for this meeting, but Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, so we went ahead without him, or without the US. So another trade deal. There's now countries like New Zealand really trying to push for trade agreements with China, and so I guess I don't quite understand why he pulls out of those trade deals and kind of leaves the way open for agreements with China. Like I say, it might not be a topic for this meeting, but I think it's something that is quite interesting about the role and influence of China in that area of the world.
The comrade behind you, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I thought that was a really brilliant analysis. I've got a question about the way that, because of this imperialist conflict and the way that Iran is seen as a thorn in the side of the US, some interpretations of protests in Iran can be distorted, because I feel that there's an element of the left, especially online, that see anything the Iranians do is inherently good, even though it's the Iranian regime, because it's against the US. So you sometimes get these interpretations of the mass protests by, obviously all working class people against the Iranian regime as, basically being faked by Israel and the US. And I think it's really important that we understand that, because we understand class and imperialism, we don't simplify things to just imperialist versus anti-imperialist powers. I think an example of that, and why it's so important, is if you go back to the Iranian Revolution itself, and in 1981 the Marxist left was still hugely powerful, and people forget that. The Iranian Communist Party, Fedayeen, Mujahideen, still had a big influence, but they took a position that because the regime was anti-imperialist, they had a kind of hands-off position, as far as I understand it, and that contributed to them really letting their guard down, not continuing the struggle in terms of the working class, and pushing the revolution forward. And the tragic consequence of that is they were literally all massacred. Tens of thousands of people were killed in the early 80s by the regime. So, I think it's important to understand that just because Iran has a regime of anti-imperialist, it doesn't mean that we don't support any, revolutionary working class movement within Iran.
I just wanted to what you thought about Britain taking control of that Iranian oil tanker. What that could possibly
So, when the Iraq War was happening, it was obviously one of the biggest protests we've seen, and I just wondered, from a British perspective now, in the current UK political atmosphere is completely different, but what that might mean for if there was an advance towards war, what that protest might mean now in terms of the current political atmosphere, and also how it might join up with the current climate strikes and climate protests.
Cool, thank you.
It'd be interesting to hear interesting contradiction in a way. On the one hand, Trump seems to be consistent in trying to undo every policy that Obama has ever had, including pulling out the nuclear deal with Iran. And yet at the same time there's that continuity, isn't there? Really nothing seems to, in terms of American foreign policy everywhere, really, nothing seems to have changed between Obama and now Trump, except how circumstances have changed, which obviously lead to tweaks in the policy, but other than that it's the same. And yet, in Trump's head, he's doing everything that's different to Obama, and I just wonder how that plays.
Let Simon wrap up.
Thank you. I just want to start off by being soft on Israel. I can assure you I am not soft on Israel. I just for me, it was just to spend a little bit more time on Saudi Arabia. I also assumed people would know that I think Israel is a nasty, shitty, expansionist regime that is the source of quite a lot of misery for people in the Middle East. But the Israelis really have very limited options in terms of attacking Iran. I mean, they couldn't really hold South Lebanon. I'm not quite sure how they're going to hold, how they're going to take on Iran. And so I think what people have to think about, and I guess this is where I made the assumption, which is the really close relations developing between the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, and how their ideas and their anti-Iranian sort of stances begin to gel and create a new force. But I wanted to kind of really emphasize the stuff on the stuff with Saudi Arabia, because I think we know what Israel's capable of, and we know quite a lot of us know who did the history of Israel. I think Saudi Arabia is a little bit more opaque, so I wanted to spend a little bit more time on that. But yes, it's the Israelis, especially the Netanyahu, but is there a left in Israel? I'm not quite sure. Is there a more moderate wing of the Israeli regime? They all pretty much agree the same thing, which was what is the biggest threat to them at the moment. It is Iran, and they would like to see Iran smashed to pieces. But they themselves won't be able to do it. They need the Americans, and they'll need the Saudis definitely to do it. But yes, they're very interested in that. Just on the question of the nuclear issue, again, it was something I kind of touched on, but I think it's really, really important, because I was just, while you were doing all the kind of interesting things, I was just having a quick look at a report, just basically saying the way in which now Iran has announced that it has gone over its enrichment cap, which was part of the G5+1, the nuclear deal that Trump has ripped up. The Iranians are pushing forward, and you really feel the sense in which Iran is being very much pushing at the weaknesses of the US, and you really see the way in which it's happening. And for me, for the shooting down of the drone, I thought it was quite an extraordinary act, because it is a statement of military prowess, because this is very, very sophisticated, and it is a statement of intention that actually, if you want to play war with us, then we're prepared to go to war. And actually, you want to see how close we are to the oil production and how close the US is to Middle East oil production. And actually, for the Iranians, an economy which is being crushed really under the new sanctions, really it's not a bad option to push and to humiliate humiliate America. Turkey, Iran, strong relations, yeah, but they are a competing set of relations. They are close, at the same time they are in competition. You really see that competition inside of Iraq. There is a kind of gentleman's agreement taking place that, that the Iranians have the south and the Turks have the north. But you know how these dynamics can shift very, very, very dramatically. For all we know, there could be an access, an alliance that appears between Turkey and Iran. It could be quite strong, but at the same time, you can also see the ways in which Turkey can come back into the NATO fold. So this is the thing, I guess, why I'm saying I'm not making predictions, because the situation is so unstable that it's pointless trying to make predictions. All you can do is point to the roots of the instability and understand it there. Just on the question of the difference between Iraq and Iran. First of all, when the Americans and the Brits invaded Iraq, they invaded a country on the verge of starvation, in which pretty much most of its industry had collapsed, which had no air force, which had very old tanks. I remember seeing an interview with an Iraqi commander saying about how they were facing the kind of most advanced American tanks with a Russian model from 1969. That really was that it was a very unequal struggle, and that the war and mission accomplished. The older people here will remember how quickly the regime fell, and how quickly the Americans declared victory, and how quickly that victory turned to dust. Iraq is smaller than Iran. The Iranian population is probably 3 times bigger than that of Iraq. The Iranian military is much more sophisticated than that of Iraq. And I think any kind of direct attack by the US on Iran will be, as I call it, a walk in the park, or a cakewalk, a walk in the cake. I don't know which one to use. So I think there are people inside the US military who are going, the only way we can knock out a military facility that's dug under a mountain is to use some kind of nuclear weapon. Actually, we're not going to do that. That is extraordinarily dangerous. But I should have brought a picture of the Straits of Hormuz just to get a sense of how the choke point works, and how that coastline of Iran is extraordinarily well defended, extraordinarily well militarized, and even though the Americans can make huge amounts of damage, as they know from Iraq, that's probably not going to be enough. So I think the kind of risky option for them with more the kind of more sensible heads or the cooler heads inside of the US said, forget about Mr. Drone, and we'll just have to look after Mr. Drone's family. That was just one that was lost. But don't underestimate the sophistication. This was the most modern piece of American kit, and it was knocked out by a tin pot third world country. I use that as a compliment. For the Iranians to show them how quickly, how easy it is to do that. The Iranians have also developed strategies to deal with overwhelming military force. They call it swarming. So they'll swarm hundreds and 1,000 boats or something, attack boats straight into the Persian Gulf, which can just absolutely rip apart anything that's there and completely choke off oil. The Saudis originally made, with the rise of kind of Iranian power, the Saudis decided to build pipelines to bypass. So there's pipelines now running from the Shia areas of Saudi Arabia, by the way, which are the big oil-producing areas, so that they can go across the desert. But I don't know if people also saw a story, I think it was about a month ago, in which some kind of drone landed on the pipelines. It didn't explode, but I think it was another thing that says there's nothing you have here which is not out of our reach. So if you want to go to war with Iran, then Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates will suffer massively as a consequence. And even if you send in 100, 200, 300,000 troops like you did in Iraq, there's no guarantee, because Iraq was much smaller, Iraq was much weaker, so imagine coming for us. But of course, war itself has its own momentum. I remember I was reading stuff about the First World War, and you're saying, well, why would European powers completely and utterly demolish a whole continent and kill off millions of people in a war that seems completely illogical? Unless you understand the beginnings of the First World War and the way in which the First World War was driven by the logic of imperialism and so on, actually you can begin to see the way in which, even though it seems to run against all logic, against anything which is sensible, that war itself can have its own dynamic. I just want to talk very quickly about the oil. I think it's really important. The fracking industry in the US means that now the US is a net exporter of oil. But the amount of fracking that's taking place and the amount of oil that's being pumped out means that this fracking industry is also in a crisis of overproduction. And they're now talking about warnings about large parts of the fracking industry facing bankruptcy in the US. Some of them are talking about the climate change stuff, of course that's really important, but this is the main dynamic. When the US was a net importer of oil, and it really kind of drove the super profits, the oil super profits, control over the Middle East became really, really, really important. Very, very important. But now, is it so important? Is it that important? Don't know. Is there a future to it? And so on. So you begin to see in which the doubts are beginning to creep in, and that it's not really an economic necessity for the US to see Syrian oil, for example. So why would, people say, why people will say, why were US troops in eastern Syria? Well, it was because really there's oil in eastern Syria. But I don't know if people know about oil in eastern Syria, but it's the worst possible oil there is. It's like really high sulfur content. It's actually quite rubbish. There's really no point in taking it. Actually, the whole question of oil itself is beginning to, it's not totally fading away, but it's becoming less and less important in people's calculations. As I say, the Saudi ruling class itself is detaching itself from oil by simply stealing the money and running off, probably going to live in south of France or somewhere, and dumping all the oil infrastructure. It's very much seen as an old industry with not much future. Where are we? The left inside Iran. It would be really great if we can spend quite a lot of time in Iran, because I think it's a really fascinating country, fascinating way in which the working class resistance to essentially a neoliberal drive that comes in the 1990s, early 2000s, in which a section of the Iranian ruling class attempt to restructure the Iranian economy. So all the kind of processes that we have lived through just everywhere else in the world are also taking place inside of Iran. There's also another thing which is taking place inside of Iran, which is the massive and dramatic effect of the climate catastrophe. Large sections of northern Iran are now becoming uninhabitable. And this itself kicked off one of the most recent, I think it was last year, one of the most recent kind of uprisings, which was about water. Where's the water? What are we going to do about it? And so on. So there's a whole number of dynamics that are taking place. A lot of people, we supported the 2009 uprising, if you want to call it that, inside of Iran, but very few, other people on the left didn't and saw it as some kind of imperial plot. Underneath, if you like, the constant threat, existential threat to Iran from the West and so on, there is a very lively and alive process of struggle, class struggle, lots of strikes constantly, lots of attempts at shifting things, a sense in which the sections of the Iranian regime feel they're losing control and so on. So I just think it's really straightforward. If I'm living inside Iran, of course, the last thing I want is to be invaded by imperial power. But at the same time, we do actually want to change the regime in terms of not Western terms, but we want a revolution that changes the nature, that puts people in the driving seat and so on. That dynamic exists inside of Iran, even though it's an enemy of the US, in the same way that exists inside of Egypt, even though Egypt, it was an ally of the US. And it was really interesting. So following the 2009 stuff, for me, it was less what was happening in the northern suburbs of Tehran, the more middle-class areas of Tehran, but what was happening in the textile centres, where there was huge fights with the police that echoed quite a lot what was happening in Mahal al-Kubra inside of Egypt. That this process of revolution and resistance and so on is alive inside of Iran. But unfortunately, as long as there is this massive existential threat, that actually this won't be able to develop. So the thing that's holding back, funnily enough, any kind of fundamental real change inside of Iran is the fact that it is constantly under threat. And it is not simply something the Iranian ruling class are making up to keep people down. There is actually this threat actually remains. So for us, relieving the sanctions is very important because I think it will begin to open up stuff for some kind of fundamental change. I just want to, I've gone on far too much, sorry. Just a couple of points. One is protest the war today. I think it's really important. I think there's a fundamental difference today from what we have today than what we had in 2003. So when the Iranians or the Americans, whoever it did, put the limpet mines or fired missiles on the oil tankers, everyone went, oh, it's the Iranians, blah, blah, blah. And what did Jeremy Corbyn say? Where's the proof? Where's the evidence? That's such a massive difference to what it was like with Tony Blair, where it was just like immediately a poodle, immediately backing everything the US said. So it's really, I think what has changed is the experience of the anti-war movement and the fact that, I know people old enough to be in the anti-war movement at the time, how we were ridiculed, that we didn't really know what we were talking about, how things weren't going to get better and so on, and how different it is now that really the common understanding of the war in Iraq was a complete bloody disaster, it was based on lies, and we're never ever going to do that again. And if there wasn't an anti-war movement, I don't believe there would have been that. So no, we didn't stop the war in Iraq, but we did stop the war in Iran. And I have direct evidence of this, because I was working as a journalist in English language newspaper in Beirut, and I took it upon myself, as when Baghdad was falling, to phone the British Foreign Office for an interview. And I was saying, what's going on, what's the strategy, we don't really understand. And he was like, oh, I'll tell you something off the record, the Foreign Office official told me, which was, Tony Blair's been really good because, George Bush was contemplating, do we turn left and invade Syria, or do we turn right and invade Iran? And Tony Blair was there to stop him and make things sensible. I remember laughing. Actually, that's how they were. That's honestly how they thought. It was like, Iraq's just a stepping stone. The next stop, either we go left or we go right. Which place are we going to take? And it is that combination of the anti-war movement and experience of the anti-war movement, but also the massive uprising and resistance inside of Iraq that really ended that. And I just want to finish, just to come back very quickly, just on the question of imperialism. Can we classify Russia and China as imperialism? Well, I say I don't use it as an insult, but as an explanation. It's really interesting because if you read the history of the US in the Middle East, you will notice the rhetoric when France and Britain ran the place. the Americans were considered anti-colonial. We are the anti-colonial power, they would say. And you read this stuff, and it's quite fascinating. There was very little American, input. They were really kind of carved out by Britain and France. And with the US coming in, it was, we will not colonize your country. It's not what we're going to do. It's about free trade and so on and so on. You can see this kind of rhetoric, and no one hated the Americans. My family still have a tin from the 1920s, which is American Aid, an American Aid tin, in which they loved, and they kept it on the counter at home. My grandparents kept the counter at home as an expression of how people felt about America at the time. You were people coming to help us and all this kind of stuff. And it was really interesting because when I was working as a journalist, we always had something when the American embassy came to visit the newsroom. When the American embassy, we always knew the American embassy was coming to visit the newsroom because we all had to leave the building. The only person allowed to remain inside the building was the editor and the deputy editor, because they didn't trust any of us. I don't know why, but there you go. And so we had to, like, the Americans are coming, everyone out of the building, we just went for lunch, and then we had to come back. And it was like, if you saw Americans in central Beirut, they were security guards, special forces, running around in their Humvees, doing all that kind of stuff. You could see what America was. It was this big imperial military thing. When the Chinese came to visit, the Chinese delegation came to visit the newsroom, no one had to leave the room. In fact, they just came around and shook everyone's hand. Oh, thank you very much, thank you very much. And it was really interesting because no one ever burns Chinese flags on the streets of the Arab world. Not yet, anyway. But everyone burnt the American flag. And you have to understand the kind of difference between it. When they came to rebuild the port of Beirut, who came to do it? The Chinese. When they came to restructure the whole of the Algerian oil industry, who came to do it? The Chinese. Actually, Chinese capital was so important to rebuilding and restructuring of the Arab world. So important because not only did they bring all the equipment, but they brought also all the workers. No need to train any native workers. They just brought in Chinese workers who had all the skills, and they did it. To buy anything American was just considered to be completely idiotic because it was far too expensive, etc. So you always bought Chinese. So you saw the way in which China was stepping in more and more. But I've never seen a Chinese soldier on the streets of the Middle East. I've never seen. So is it imperialism? Yes, it is. Because it's the beginning of the economic aspect of it. If you look in Africa, China's buying up huge tracts of land. Chinese capital is really crucial. It's just that when they say, then if we compare it to Russia, which has very few economic interests, but huge amounts of military interests. So we have to understand the way in which imperialism works. It isn't simply this lot are bad, but actually that it is an expression of expansion of capital that is really important. I just want to, I've been given 30 seconds, that's a shut up note. So I just want to actually thank, I'm really sorry I couldn't get everything in, but I just want to finish by saying that on the 20th of September, there's going to be a general strike for climate. And I would love it if we could destroy the capitalist class in Britain. If we could destroy the capitalist class in Britain and in the US, God, how wonderful it would be then for us in the Middle East. Oil is a curse on the world, but it's a really direct curse for people in the Arab world. And I'd love the general strike on the 20th of September for climate to be one that also spreads across the Arab world. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing for everyone?